Buenos días. Good morning, CABE. Claudio Sánchez, a native of Nogales, Mexico, graduated from Northern Arizona University with a post-baccalaureate studies at the University of Arizona in Tucson. As an education correspondent for the National Public Radio, NPR, he focuses on the 3 Ps of education reform: politics, policy, and pedagogy. A former elementary and middle school teacher, he now reports regularly on NPR's edition award, All Things Considered, and Weekend Edition. Amongst the many awards that Claudio has received is the Alfred I. DuPont, Columbia University Silver Button, for a series he co-produced, Sanctuary, the New Underground Railroad. You can learn more about Claudio's life and career and numerous awards on page 149 of the conference program. Here to address the importance of bilingualism and cultural identity in our schools and communities, please join me in welcoming Claudio Sánchez.
Thank you. Thank you, Carlene. Buenos dias, good morning. I'm looking at this huge clock here in which I'm supposed to cover a lot of ground. So one of the things I decided to do was kind of break this down into chapters of sort, and to give you a sense of who I am and what my job over the last 40 years has been, both as a teacher and a journalist. I should say I'm privileged to be here among you, to be able to address you. And I'm hoping I'm not just preaching to the choir and maybe challenge you a bit, make you think outside of the comfort zones that we all fall into. I come from a part of the world where an education is a lifeline for those of us who start life with very little. The U.S.-Mexico border is a nation unto itself, not Mexico, not the U.S. As the writer Norma Cantú aptly puts it, the border is a wound that never heals and yet is forever healing. The poor working-class neighborhood where I was born wasn't far from the 20-foot high fence that separates Nogales, Arizona from Nogales, Sonora. The dusty streets of Colonia Ingenieros today seem more narrow, with the dozens of houses still perched miraculously on a rocky hillside. My wife and I, Maria Teresa, were there recently, and it was eye-opening to revisit that home, that place we call the border. Ilegales, en comillas, men and women from all parts of Mexico would come through here when I was a child. They'd knock on my grandmother's door to ask for food and water on their trek north before vanishing into the nearby gullies and hills that people now call Cocaine Alley. Today, no one dares open their doors, let alone help these people. Fear trumps charity. When I was a child, though, my friends and I would venture unafraid into the desert hills with wads of flour tortillas in our pockets that we could trade for a story or two about where these ilegales were headed: Phoenix, Los Angeles, Chicago, Kansas City, probably Sacramento as well. Places I knew nothing about, although I imagined them to be beautiful fluorescent cities. I latched onto those stories, convinced that just beyond that 20-foot high fence that separates Mexico from the US, these beautiful fluorescent cities beckoned, and yes, in my innocence, I believed that they were even worth dying for. Still, I love Colonia Ingenieros, my neighborhood. My mother did not. All she saw was poor people imprisoned by their fatalism. My mother, a voracious reader with 2 years of college, thanks to the philanthropy of an old priest, pretty much kept to herself. So when my parents separated, my father, and a man with a sixth grade education, left to work in the alfalfa fields in Peoria, Arizona. My mother, an ambitious woman, eventually grew tired of Mexico. She hated walking past the gauntlet of women in the neighborhood, peering from behind their long, dark shawls, always whispering, ¿Y qué de los hijos, pobrecitos, sin padre? And what of her children, poor souls, without a father? My mother was convinced, though, that as a single parent, life would be easier in the United States. Even though, in a strange way, we felt poorer in this country than we had ever felt in Mexico. Still, my mother would relentlessly lecture her children, your appearance, the way you carry yourself, the precision of your speech will pave the way to a better life. And no matter what, you must hold on to your dignity, like your life depends on it. Dignity, often on the border, is hard to come by. At Nogales High School, 90% of the students were Mexican American, mostly poor. Speaking English with a thick accent was a curse. Losing your accent meant that you were ready to mingle and move up among the kids who wore their assimilation proudly. Only then could you dare mingle with the wealthy kids and who ran the school the way their parents ran the city's politics and economics. As a teenager, growing up in the US, the key lesson for me was that the process of assimilation quickly brings all newcomers to a crossroads of sorts, an identity crisis. I remember wanting desperately to shed my alienhood by realizing that because of how I looked, I would forever be labeled resident alien, Mexican American, Chicano, Pocho, Hispanic, her panic, your panic, our panic, as my mother would often joke. I grew up visualizing my future, though, through the prism of America's promise. The opportunity to succeed and prosper is the reason some people from around the world, of course, come to this country to reinvent themselves. This, after all, is the true genius of America. Today, our nation is at a crossroads. It's facing its own identity crisis. In the midst of a debate over economic mobility, opportunity, immigration, and the American dream itself. The roots of that identity, ladies and gentlemen, of that crisis, is that there are two conflicting impulses. First, the desire to embrace all immigrants because at some level, most Americans, immigrants themselves, identify with their search for a better life. That sentiment, at some point, gives way to contempt because we are not so much a nation of immigrants as we are a nation of laws, as if it was a matter of either or. So let me turn to the issue of language. En su importante libro, Hunger of Memory, el académico y periodista Richard Rodriguez sugiere, en base a su propia asimilación, que el niño inmigrante solo puede ser aceptado y recompensado si se educa. Pero para lograrlo tiene que entregarse a una especie de amnesia cultural y lingüística para poder forjar una nueva identidad. Para muchos como Rodríguez, el español no es un idioma sino un código propio de una subcultura ajena y contraria a nuestra asimilación. En otras palabras, para lograr todos los privilegios que a uno le corresponden en este país, tenemos que olvidar, descartar nuestras raíces. Porque no obstante la promesa y las promesas y oportunidades que esta gran democracia nos extiende, detrás del telón la cultura mayoritaria aún no acepta ese cambio que implica esta transformación demográfica. Mucha gente huye a sus suburbios por temor de que sus hijos se vayan a mezclar con niños pobres, morenos, que no saben hablar inglés. Es decir, la diversidad de la que tanto se habla y desea es buena, en teoría, pero en práctica es menos deseable y hasta peligrosa. At the risk of preaching to the choir, let me suggest that language, mastering English, both English and our native tongues, is key not just to our identity and dignity, but to our future as Americans. But first, let me vanquish at least a couple of old ghosts. In his memorable book, Hunger of Memory, Richard Rodriguez suggests that Latino immigrants in particular must succumb to a linguistic and cultural amnesia of sorts in order to assimilate, because Spanish, after all, is not so much a language but a code with little or no currency, except when we withdraw into the shadows where a different socio-political subculture, some would even say underclass, thrives. Now, in my view, that was part of the thinking that led to the ban on bilingual education in California back in 1998, when 61% of voters passed Proposition 227 and banned what was called transitional bilingual education. Most of us remember the angry political debate about how bilingual education programs would somehow make our children less loyal to America, and more likely to turn them into militant separatists. One could argue that Proposition 58 is not just the restoration of a crucial educational and laudable goal, but an attempt to right a tremendous wrong. Today, more than 1.3 million school-aged children in California, about a fifth of the state's public school students, have grown up speaking a language other than English at home. But it's clear that the shift in public support for bilingual education, monolingual education, is dead. The shift in the support for bilingual education is a recognition that children, all children, must master at least 2 languages in order to succeed in this economy. And as we all know, it's not just California. Go to any state in the southern United States in particular, where the growth of non-English speaking kids has been greatest, especially Latinos, and you will see how this transformation has taken hold. Torn by identity. Let me talk about that. Several years ago, on a reporting assignment in Southern California, I met a woman you all probably have heard of, Silvia Mendez, who as a 9-year-old living in Santa Ana, California, was forced to attend segregated Mexican schools. Americans forget that, just like in the Deep South, Mexicans were segregated in this state and in the Southwest, just like African American kids were. So in Santa Ana, Silvia Mendez was forced to attend segregated Mexican schools because all the white school board members felt that Mexican children were too dirty, too dumb, too sickly to attend schools with white children. Mendez was the name, of course, of the landmark case here in California called Mendez versus Westminster, 1946. It was, as again you may know, the framework, the legal framework for the NAACP and Thurgood Marshall to make its arguments before the U.S. Supreme Court in Topeka versus Board of Education. Or I should say, Brown versus Topeka Board of Education. People forget that history. And yet, in spending time with Mrs. Mendez, she grew up loving America, thanking America, embracing its promises. So she cringes when she hears the views of Latinos who've grown up bitter, feeling like second-class citizens, or as she put it, trapped in victimhood. One 27-year-old Chicano school principal who ran a charter school in East LA, who I remember meeting, comes to mind. He said to me, "Claudio, California was taken from us, and we were going to reclaim it, and we are going to reclaim it, one child at a time." Then there was the Ivy League-educated Chicano from Oxnard, a businessman, activist in his community, a man from very humble beginnings. Despite his success, he empathized with the cultural estrangement of first-generation immigrants, and he lived with a not-so-secret guilt about being successful when he was surrounded by so much poverty and low levels of education in his community. Being a model Latino is a burden, he said, but he still believed it was his obligation to set an example, to shout from the highest mountain, "Yes, America, your promises are real, and I'm living proof of it." Finally, there was a white, liberal, tenured college professor who I spoke to about many of these interviews that I had done. And he listened to all this in dismay. He conceded that for all the talk of opportunity and equality, most middle and upper middle class families, particularly white families, usually flee the minute they perceive that their schools and neighborhoods are being overrun by poor, working class, dark-skinned families and their children who don't speak proper English and who don't share their values, whatever those values are. It was an honest assessment, I thought, of how many people, not just in this state but across this country, truly feel. Integration, it turns out, is a good thing in theory, but in practice it's messy, it's threatening. Even though as a nation of immigrants, we recognize that our roots are deeply tied to the Latino experience in particular, we are unwilling as a nation to sacrifice our offspring to the altar of diversity. Maybe not out of bigotry, but out of fear. Or what social scientists these days now call the Latino threat narrative. I'm here to tell you that education is not an antidote to bigotry, but I, for one, am convinced that education is the most powerful tool with which we can, in a way, help weather this fear and this alienation. El reto por delante, the challenge ahead. En mis 40 años como maestro, periodista, continúo remontándome en una historia singular, más que en ninguna otra. La historia de niños y adolescentes inmigrantes, sobre todo latinoamericanos, en su mayoría niños y jóvenes que nacieron en Estados Unidos de padres inmigrantes, tanto legales como indocumentados. Nuestra actitud hacia esta comunidad, su cultura, su idioma, es producto de un conflicto interno muy profundo. Nuestro primer impulso es el deseo de aceptarlos, porque en cierta forma nos identificamos con ellos, con su búsqueda por una vida mejor. Esa actitud se desmorona, reemplazada por un argumento politizado y rencoroso. Después de todo, somos no tanto una nación de inmigrantes, sino una nación de leyes, leyes que estos inmigrantes indocumentados violan cada día que permanecen en este país. Los cambios demográficos en Estados Unidos, sin embargo, dictan, más bien exigen, una resolución a este dilema. Según el censo, más del 45% de los niños menores de 5 años de edad hoy no son anglosajones. California, como todos sabemos, es esa ventana al futuro de nuestro destino. Por eso organizaciones como la de ustedes es clave en el debate y en la resolución del dilema del que me refiero. Sin embargo, hoy, aquí en California, como en este país, este destino del que hablo, desafortunadamente, es una incógnita. Hoy la realidad es esta. Mucha de nuestra gente vive en la pobreza, con poca educación, sin hablar inglés, sin saber inglés. Una juventud relegada a un sistema escolar deficiente y muchas veces mediocre. Para muchos niños, la escuela se convierte en una barrera. Su educación y asimilación se convierte en un proceso de enajenamiento, apatía, rebeldía, desinterés. Las instituciones educacionales ven todo esto con asombro, sin darse cuenta que muchas veces ellas contribuyen a este gran problema. La interrogante es cómo rescatar a jóvenes invisibles. Children who, despite their numbers, might as well be invisible. That is where you come in. Your work, your commitment. Every day you toil in those classrooms. And as we've seen and heard this morning, the exemplary people, quality of people who are dedicated to this task is worthy of recognizing. But you in your hearts know why this is important, if not because you were a product of this dilemma, but because in your heart of hearts, even if you weren't, you understand what it means to the future of this nation. En conclusión, let me end with the bittersweet story of David Martinez, a skinny 9-year-old who grew up in Barstow, California. When I met David, he was a student at 20 de Noviembre Elementary in Tijuana. It's hard to say 20 de Noviembre Elementary in Tijuana. At the time, Baja California was home to about 12,000 U.S.-born children whose parents had been deported. And I just learned this morning that that number is now closer to 50,000. Think about that. Researchers call these children los invisibles because so many of them have ended up in a kind of educational limbo. They don't read or write in Spanish because all their schooling was in this country, where they could not hang on to their Spanish. At 20 de Noviembre, teachers and administrators, however, embraced these children like David, although he seemed a little embarrassed about his accent. David confessed that he still had trouble saying 20 de Noviembre. When I met him, his fourth grade teacher told me, David is a work in progress. He's bright. He's a happy, healthy young man. But he is an example of the task, of the challenge of receiving these young children and not letting them become invisibles. At 20 de Noviembre, David is not segregated or put in some far-off corner of the school, separate from Spanish-speaking students. He's paired with native Spanish speakers. He gets lots of one-on-one tutoring to build his vocabulary and his grammar. He, in turn, helps classmates with their English, because in Mexican schools, English is a highly prized skill, not a stigma. In other words, David feels respected, valued. He does not appear to be or feel invisible, invisible. Think about how important that is in thinking about the children that you all know and care for. The value of feeling respected. Like your ethnicity, your language, your family matter. That they're just as important as any other child. And then think of the history that we've had to overcome to achieve that. David is thriving, I hear. I haven't seen him. I've been contemplating going back to Tijuana, 20 de Noviembre Elementary, to see how he's doing. It's a worthwhile story to go back and see how David is doing. And I understand he is thriving in large part, not just because he's so bright, but because he gets so much academic and emotional support, so much nurturing. But there's something else about this young boy. He has learned a lot about himself and his world, and the world he left behind in Barstow, California. When we interviewed him, he told me, you know, I was never white when I was in Barstow. I was always brown. And I remember he pulled up his shirt and he showed me his arm as if to show me, here's how brown I am. And he says, now I belong to Mexico. And I remember he kind of even corrected me, not Mexico, Mexico. And I came away from that interview with this little boy pretty impressed, if not awed, by his wisdom. Because it felt like I was getting a glimpse of how this little boy had begun to take control of his own identity at such a young age. And yet I wondered about his future, about David's future, and about our future. And I worry. As educators, you are both at the forefront and in the trenches of this nation's identity crisis. I don't know if you see it that way, but that's the way I see it as a reporter, as a journalist. Because you're helping shape a new American identity. It's not just a battle over race, language, or ethnicity, or class. I think it's a battle about an idea that an education or an educated citizenry in a representative democracy will only thrive if and only if we can chart a common course regardless of our race, ethnicity, language, or class. In some ways, this is, in essence, a reckoning for America and for us all, in a battle for the hearts and minds of Americans all. Let me end by telling you that even though I taught for a couple of years, I have never, ever lost my admiration for the work you do. You know, when I started covering education for NPR, I was hired to cover immigrations as well. In fact, I thought it was more the beat that I wanted. I'd been working along the U.S.-Mexico border most of my career, out of Tijuana, San Diego, Tucson, Arizona, Nogales, El Paso, Juarez. And I had spent time mostly covering immigration policy, the militarization of the border. So when NPR said, look, we'd like you to cover education as well, I thought, well, maybe for a few years. But the more I covered this beat, the more I realized I was getting a front row seat to the future and what the future portends. And it was right at the time with the demographic shift in this country of the so-called minority majority in most school districts across this country, not just in Texas and Florida and Illinois and California, but throughout this country, when it had really taken hold and it had captivated at least the media. Not all for good, because there was always a temptation to that knee-jerk reaction of saying we're being invaded, we're being taken over, as the rhetoric goes. This nation is losing its roots, and again, being myopic and not understanding that this nation's roots were precisely the fact that so many countries from so many different languages had become its foundation. So why were Latinos different? And so in my reporting, I suppose I've taken it almost as a journalistic obligation to expose what I think, and what many would agree, is this identity crisis. And we are not even covering, we as media, I would include NPR in this, we are not even covering the tip of that iceberg. The transformation taking place now has caught us unprepared. Even scholars at institutions that we all respect for the depth of their studies and their scholarly work to try and explain to this nation what's ahead. We're missing the real story. And I've always felt that aside from California and places like, and Texas, for example, where the history is so much deeper, the place to watch is the southern United States. I was in a little town called Gainesville, Georgia, just north of Atlanta, what many people refer to as the next Los Angeles, if it isn't already. And I remember dropping in on a community that I had heard had had a real struggle accepting, assimilating mostly Mexican workers, both legal and not documented. Purdue, the chicken outfit, had literally imported these workers to work for meager wages in their warehouses. And I remember visiting the single high school, not a single bilingual teacher at this high school. And I remember meeting with parents and with teachers, and I remember they had segregated kids who didn't know English well in one school. The high school-age kids were segregated in a corner of the high school where few people even realized they were there. They were ghettoized. And in talking to a family, and I met them at a Friday football game, you know, Friday football in Georgia is next to maybe going to, for Catholics anyway, going to Mass on Sundays. I remember sitting down with this family who were in the stands, and I remember they were being treated like celebrities. And the more I looked into their story, it turned out that the father was a truck driver. And, you know, he barely had time to spend time with his family and his kids. But his son, a 16-year-old, he told me a story of how one day Julian, his son, they had just arrived from Michoacan. And he had been out in the field kicking a soccer ball around. And the football team was practicing somewhere down another side of the field. And the coach, off the corner of his eye, caught this kid kicking this ball a mile. And he walked over to him and he gave him this football. And he said, "Kick this for me. And try and put it between those two goals down a few yards down." They spent that afternoon with that kid kicking 60-mile field goals. I mean, 60-yard field goals. Miles is an exaggeration. So this young man, overnight, is taken in by the football team, And the following Friday night that he played, the day that I was at that game with his dad, he broke the Georgia state record for high schools and the distance of the kick to football, 62 yards. And the reason all this became important in my story about Gainesville was because all that hatred, that resentment, both by black and white parents about this invasion, melted away when this young man became a football hero. And it spoke to me in the sense that it said to me, look, there is nothing that this tension that we now live through cannot solve. There's nothing that we cannot solve given this tension. Even if it means something as simple as seeing a young Mexican kid kick a 62-yard field goal. It may sound trivial, it may sound simple, but I want you to think of it as an example of how senseless our relationship as immigrants is in this country. The politics and the rhetoric are not going to go away anytime soon, ladies and gentlemen. But every one of you knows, and here's, I guess, my message. Every one of you knows and has an anecdote, a story, like the one I just told you, where people can begin to understand what unites us more than what divides us. And if you take it upon yourselves to tell these stories, not just among yourselves or at conferences like this, but among parents, lawmakers, policymakers, one story can begin to melt away the challenge, the really tough road that we have ahead of us. I will end by saying that I am open ears. I am more than willing to sit down with you, maybe after this presentation, and hear some of those stories that can help me better understand my job, and telling them and sharing them with a national audience as well. I would be remiss if I did not, if Amparo from California is in the audience, to thank her and to thank Enrique Gonzalez. Amparo, I see you there. Enrique Gonzalez for having made our story about David possible. Thank you. And thank you for listening.